It's great to see everyone. Thank you for all attending. Um, some of you I know, many of you I know of, and some of you I hope to meet. I'm thinking about writing another book, and this PowerPoint is going to be about this book project, but I can't. Oh, there it is. Okay, so so I put together too many PowerPoints for a 15-minute presentation, and what I want to do is I want to outline the chapters of this book, and then I want to focus on false evidence ploys in particular, which is one of the chapters. So this book would be a historical, theoretical, empirical, psychological, legal, policy analysis of the use of deception, which is inherent and widespread in American police interrogation, unlike the countries Ray spoke about and many other European countries. And I see it as kind of a sequel to my 2008 book, Police Interrogation in American Justice. And in that book, I said there were three eras in American history of police interrogation: the era of the third degree and physical violence, which was finally reformed by the end of the 1930s, that led to the era of police professionalism, which I dated to the next 60 years. Perhaps the high water mark was the famous Miranda warnings. And then I said the 1990s was the era of innocence, where we were all obsessed with false confessions and wrongful convictions. And the primary reform was the recording, promoted in the United States, is the recording of interrogations, which now is law in a majority of the states in some form or another. And I ended the book by saying the next big issue in America, the next era, might be defined by police deception. And Ray had mentioned the law in Illinois that Governor Pritzker just signed. The Innocence Project in the United States has bills before five state Congresses. This is starting to heat up as an issue, and hence my interest in the topic. I've actually been interested in the topic for a long time, but this is an outline of the book chapters, and I just want to briefly mention them, and then I'll pivot to false evidence ploys, which I guess is chapter 3. So let me just walk through some of this and pick up the rest, depending on how much time I've got. So the big questions are sort of theoretical, philosophical, and empirical. Should we allow police to lie? What should be permissible? What should be impermissible? Where do we draw the line? What does the empirical research show? Does it work? What are the countervailing considerations? And what are the issues for a democratic society? So this is really big picture stuff. And in the initial chapter, I would want to overview the adversary system in America, the goals of the adversary system, which are often in conflict, checking state power, protecting legal rights, promoting truth finding, and think about how allowing police to use deception affects or undermines those goals. And talk about what I've referred to before as the fundamental contradiction in police interrogation, which is it's never in a suspect's self-interest to give a confession. And so interrogation has to overcome that through pressure and persuasion unless a suspect voluntarily admits. And of course, Ray described, and everyone knows, the more skillful practice of investigative interviewing. But in the United States, that's not widespread, at least not yet. We still are dominated by Reed-style interrogation. And so this would be a big picture chapter about the adversary system, its contradictions and goals, and how police deception fits into that. And then a historical chapter covering the decline of the third degree, the rise of polygraphic-based interrogation, and other, I say magic bullets because there's a variety of these so-called lie detection interrogation technologies that many of you know very well, and some of you know better than me: the computer voice stress analyzer, the so-called scan, there's, oh, if you look at this historically, police interrogators have been searching for years for some magic bullet to determine whether somebody is lying, and then transform that into an interrogation strategy that, of course, looks more like a conversation and is not hampered by American law and regulations. And of course, the story involves the Reed method and behavioral analysis. And I put in a sentence here, my distillation of the Reed method: guilt presumptive, accusatory, and confirmatory interrogation based on pressure and persuasion, designed to move a suspect from denial to admission, which of course is sort of the American style method of interrogation. Most American interrogators today will deny they use the Reed method or say they were trained and they don't remember, but they're basically using the same thing, at least in my experience. And I didn't mention that in the intro. I may have skipped over it. Because this is a big picture book, I would describe, and it's a synthetic book, I would describe the empirical basis. And as some of you know, I've been doing this for many years, but every year I consult on and I work on about 100 cases. And so over the years, I've collected materials for hundreds and hundreds of cases. And of course, there is a selection bias in that, but I have now 9 binders of reports I've written in cases. I think I've got 250 case reports, where in all of those reports, I discuss deception. And so I've got a large, albeit very imperfect, data set of cases. And of course, there's many other cases people have written about in the United States. So I wouldn't be actively collecting new data because it's a big picture project, but relying on many cases that I've worked on, as well as case reports and from others and the empirical literature. Okay, so I have a feeling, I don't know. Iris told somebody that I was going to talk about false evidence ploys, so here it is. So this chapter, a taxonomy on police interrogation deception. Now, let me just say that because I am brainstorming a book project, I'm on sabbatical this year, in the beginning of a sabbatical. This is what I'm supposed to be doing. There's lots of flaws in this talk, and my thinking is underdeveloped, so I welcome critical feedback. So I've this is actually not false evidence ploys. I'll get to that, but this is a broader taxonomy of police deception. So a key issue here is how to define deception, right? And so here's my best stab at its empirical instantiation, right? Deception is usually defined as sort of knowingly lying to somebody about something, right? So if it's unintentional, it's not deception, or at least active deception. All right, deception about the adversarial role of police interrogators in the police interrogation process. This happens all the time in America. The pretense that police interrogators are their friend, they're there to help the suspect. This is a cooperative, collaborative project. Deception that distorts or contradicts the Miranda warnings happens all the time in the United States. The Miranda warnings are a speed bump. They're largely irrelevant. Police are skilled at downplaying and ignoring them. Deception about the identity of the police interrogator. I think Iris is going to talk about this. Iris, Debbie Davis, Mark Costanzo, and Haley Cleary and I are working on a paper called Interrogation by Proxy, where we talk about, are going to talk about the different ways in which police use third parties to interrogate. This could be informants. This could be what we call in the United States pretext or cold calls, where the alleged victim calls up the alleged perpetrator, and the police are sort of sitting next to them and guide them through interrogation. We have what are called Perkins, after a famous Supreme Court case, operations where police will plant a police officer or an informant in the cell of a jailmate, and that person will interrogate them. In all of these situations, the identity of the interrogator is not known because a third party is doing the interrogation at the behest of the police, and sometimes in the Perkins operations, it'll be a gang situation, fellow gang members. So that's deception about identity. False evidence ploys. So most people don't know this, but I actually coined this term with Richard Offshee in 1997. The idea, obviously, is the representation of evidence that links a suspect to the crime. And so we distinguish between true and false evidence ploys. But for deception, false evidence ploys, which I'll talk about in a moment, are our focus. I recently wrote a chapter or an article about minimization as a form of deception. I can't really read the bottom of my screen, but I think what it says is deception that downplays the legal seriousness of the offense. We all know about minimization. The opposite, deception that exaggerates the legal seriousness of the offense, maximization. Deception that suggests or promises leniency in exchange for confession. Of course, minimization shades into that. Deception that suggests or threatens implicitly or explicitly higher charges or harsher punishment. Maximization would shade into that. And then there's in the some American cases, they make this distinction. I don't really like it, but deception that is intrinsic to the case and deception that's extrinsic to the case. And so essentially what they're saying is, in some of these cases, if you threaten somebody or lie to somebody about consequences that don't have to do with the legal processing of the case, we'll say that's extrinsic. Like you tell somebody that their kids will never talk to them or their kids will be taken away, or something that doesn't have to do with the punishment or the legal consequence. Although I guess their kids being taken away is not a good example because that may flow from the case. And so I suggest here deception that suggests promises or non-legal benefits in exchange for confession, deception that suggests or threatens non-legal harms in the absence of confession. Okay, so this is what I've envisioned as chapter 3. And even though I just went through 10, I'm going to have to wrap up here. I've got a couple minutes left, but even though I went through 10 different types of deception, I do want to make the distinction between technique level deception and structural deception. And then I'll just go through the false evidence ploys and briefly mention the rest of the book and open it up to questions. So my thinking is still emergent on this. There have been a lot of distinctions about false evidence ploys, and these are overlapping, right? So you could say implicit versus explicit. You know, the Reed method begins with this idea of props. You know, you've got folders and sometimes fake videotapes, things that are marked that imply there's evidence against a suspect when there's not, as opposed to explicitly telling them. In the United States, there's some case law on oral, which is allowed verbal false evidence ploys, lying about video evidence, eyewitness evidence, surveillance evidence, versus fabricating. I really meant to put manufacturing, but the courts talk about fabricating, where you show somebody a false laboratory report, for example, or false DNA results or false witness statement. Simple versus orchestrated. I wrote about this in my 2008 book. Simple is not a process. So just telling somebody testimonial, demeanor, scientific, medical, this is the evidence we have against you, as opposed to running somebody through a polygraph or a computer voice stress analyzer or a multi-stage process where they say, now we've demonstrated that you lied, you're guilty, and then that's used as an interrogation technique. General versus specific. I see this in many of my cases. General references to false evidence as opposed to very specific, inherent false evidence ploys versus, well, I'm running out of time here, so I'm gonna have to be quick, but the implication that it's false evidence, exaggerated false evidence, anticipated false evidence, hypothetical false evidence that is based on logic. How could it be otherwise? And then most interesting, well, sort of interesting to me, true representations of false evidence, which is really not false evidence. Let me just say that there would also be a chapter on the social psychology of police deception, the consequences of police interrogation deception, the ethics of police interrogation deception, and then policy reforms. And last comment, and then I'll stop, I promise. One part of my interest in this is that all academics are opposed to police interrogation deception virtually. And it's almost reflexive and instinctive. And I think the subject is more complicated. And so I want to think about it more deeply than just saying I'm opposed to it because it increases the risk of false confession, or I'm just opposed to it because it's bad to lie to suspects. I am opposed to police interrogation deception, but I think it's subtle, it's nuanced, and there are times when we might want to permit it. Control it. It might be a necessary evil in very limited circumstances. I throw that out as a hypothesis. I apologize for going, I think, a minute over my time. Thank you, everyone.